I want to welcome everyone, first of all, for joining us today in what is the next in a series of short workshops we've planned around the topic of care in the time of COVID. My name is Jocelyn Alcott. I'm a professor of history and international comparative studies, and I currently serve as the director of the program in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here at Duke University. Today's discussion, Feminist Lessons on Vaccine Hesitancy, is particularly timely as the third COVID vaccine has recently been approved in the United States, raising questions about equity and access, but also about the widespread hesitancy regarding the vaccines themselves. The Care in the Time of COVID series emerges from an ongoing international interdisciplinary collaboration on revaluing care in the global economy, which we launched a couple of years ago. We're focused on three principal research areas. First, metrics, so how we measure care and how it affects care when we try to measure it. The second is governance, so how laws and policies both foster and reflect normative values of care. And the third is social practices, so how various practices such as household formation and kinship networks and mutual aid societies and things, and social formations inform attention to care and describe the boundaries of our communities of care. We've also started from two fundamental premises that have become even more evident in the current moment. The first is that social, cultural, and ecological care are all interdependent and imbricate. And the second is that innovative solutions to the so-called crisis of care can be found in many corners of the world, particularly those that have been most suspicious of market and technology-based solutions. The Revaluing Care in the Global Economy project has enjoyed broad support at Duke, particularly from the Office of Global Affairs. And for this series of workshops, we especially want to thank the Mellon-funded Humanities Unbounded grant program and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. If you're interested in receiving announcements about future workshops and project activities, please just put your email address in the chat box and we'll collect all of those. We are planning, we have a lot of events coming up this year in GSF in general, but for this project, we're planning a diverse schedule of events centered on how to foster an economy in the service of care and sustainability rather than the service of efficiency and growth. We have events coming up soon on queer kinship and on visualizing care. I want to turn these over now to the intellectual author of today's event, Farron Yarrow. Today's workshop emerges from her own research interests, and she's put together an amazing group of people working in this space. We'll be recording the session today, and Farron will convert this into a podcast that will be available on our website. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Farron. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jolie. So I am Farron Yarrow. I am a postdoctoral associate in GSF at Duke. And I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who has joined us today. I am really thrilled to be able to host this discussion and to learn from such brilliant colleagues. I want to again thank the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke, as well as the Dr. Jenner's Museum, Dr. Jenner's House Museum across the pond in England for support in making this happen. So today's event brings together 5 experts from different disciplinary backgrounds to discuss the issue of vaccine hesitancy as it's emerged historically as a practice, but to specifically consider what a feminist approach might offer us as a way to ethically navigate these really difficult questions about the nature of medical consent, histories of medical violence and mistrust, and the interlocking politics surrounding gender, race, disability, nation, sexuality, and class that shape patient interactions with state and health authorities. So for today, I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn before their presentations, which are about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions, please submit them to the chat box. You can either send them directly to me or to everyone. You can make it visible there, and I will read them out loud for the panelists. And I will also ask that folks please keep their microphones muted throughout the event so that we can focus on the panelists. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bernice Hausmann. So Dr. Hausmann has an undergraduate degree in literature from Yale University and a doctoral degree in feminist studies and critical theory from the University of Iowa. She spent 23 years in the Department of English at Virginia Tech before moving to Pennsylvania State University's College of Medicine, where she is the chair of humanities. And in her work, she studies medical controversies in the public sphere with published books on sex change, breastfeeding, and vaccination controversies. Her most recent book is Anti-Vax, Reframing the Vaccination Controversy, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2019. So welcome, Dr. Hausmann. Please take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides and everybody can hear me, I'm hoping. Let me just get everybody back on my screen here. So this talk is a presentation of a few vignettes that I'm using to think through a set of questions about how representations of vaccine dissenters in the news and sort of public sphere have changed over this past year. I'm trying to think through a phenomenon that appears to have significant promise, a shift from a misinformation frame to a confidence frame, but that could also go south very quickly by creating legitimate and illegitimate ways to dissent from vaccination. So there's obviously a lot more to the story that I'm going to present here, but my hope is to get some really robust feedback from all of you to help me think through these very preliminary ideas that I present here. So, okay, let me make sure. There we go. So I'm going to start with sort of the present day and then move back through this past year. These are sort of things I've experienced myself. I've read in newspapers or academic scholarship or thought about in previous research on breastfeeding with respect to this idea, the racialized, gendered nature of vaccine dissent. So I was thinking about these issues of legitimate and illegitimate vaccine dissent. And then I was watching Don Lemon late one night and I saw this exchange and there it was, right? There it was, this, if you look at, if you read this exchange, what you see is that they're trying to sort of argue that basically that communities of color and especially African-American communities have these legitimate reasons to be nervous about or concerned about or mistrust vaccination, but that Black people are not anti-vaxxers. And that's really clear. There's this desire to, because anti-vaxxers don't have legitimate reasons to dissent from vaccination and Black people do. So I'm going to take you through, this is where it started for me. I was at the Immunize Virginia conference in 2011 when a famous vaccine inventor and vaccine proponent who is a physician, you should all be familiar with this picture, said these words. He's actually said this at, the problem with vaccine refusal is too many mothers with PhDs who know too much for their own good. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario, so I wrote about On Immunity by essayist Eula Biss in my book, Anti-Vax. Biss includes two considerations of mothers whose non-immunization of their children is legitimized by their social circumstance as women of color in her book. In both descriptions, she distinguishes her role as a white affluent mother whose vaccination of her own white child is a gesture of protection and support to unvaccinated children of color, whose vaccination status is legitimated through arguments of access or morality. We see here a kind of formal grounding to the argument that Fauci and Lemon were making together. This is the third scenario. In the fall of 2014, the Los Angeles Times and the Hollywood Reporter published a series of articles on high rates of personal belief exemptions for children in the Los Angeles school districts. These were picked up by national venues like the Atlantic and the Washington Post. Although exemption rates never match rates of non-immunization, these articles compared presumed rates of non-vaccination in LA with Chad and the South Sudan, implicitly racializing the actions of wealthy, presumed white Los Angelinos with their Black African counterparts in some of the poorest countries in the world. The implication was that wealthy white Angelinos should know better than to act like impoverished Black Africans. So interestingly, I'm going to go back to this former slide. No, I'm going to go forward. Sorry, I got confused there. So this book by Jennifer Reich was published in 2016. In this text, she argues that voluntary non-vaccinators are largely affluent, white, and a privileged group. She expands her argument with an accusation: non-vaccinating mothers' protection of their own children endangers the health of poor children who are less likely to be vaccinated. These mothers, in other words, the wealthy white mothers' actions exemplify the height of neoliberal carelessness in which concern for one's own and for one's own children's well-being trumps all other concerns and endangers the health of the larger community and the social contract on which public health depends. So I argue that Reich both relies on and contributes to something I call the anti-vax imago. The imago of the anti-vax parent is an educated, affluent white woman invested in alternative medicine and concerned about chronic illnesses in her children, who researches vaccine concerns online. While highly educated, she is nevertheless unable to discern good from bad scientific research and is vulnerable to charlatans and celebrity manipulators. She is misinformed, and she is also a purveyor of misinformation. Most importantly, she should know better that vaccines are essential to the modern social contract as well as her own children's health. Interestingly, in the largest outbreak of measles in several decades in the United States in 2019, when there were over 1,200 cases, children of these mothers were not the cause nor the majority of cases. Instead, cases were highest in and largely restricted to relatively insular communities of Eastern European immigrants and ultra-Orthodox Jews, both of which had direct ties to Ukraine, which had tens of thousands of measles cases in 2019. So I want to go back to this issue that I actually examined in my first book on breastfeeding, Mother's Milk, because I've been thinking about some of the things I wrote about Linda Blum's work in that text as being related to this issue that I am trying to explore here. So in her 1999 book, At the Breast, Linda Blum writes about how middle and working class white women and working class Black women respond to the exhortation to breastfeed, and that's a term she uses. Like Jennifer Reich after her, Blum found that white middle-class women's maternal behaviors and relative success at breastfeeding compared to their working class and Black counterparts were made possible by their privilege. Instead of suggesting that more women might like those privileges, she, like Reich, criticizes those white women for practicing the motherhood made available to them. In this way, white middle-class women can, and this is a quotation, can practice a mindful body who can speak back to medical and technoscientific authority, but only because she is a very specific and privileged woman. So during COVID-19, and especially after the Black Lives Matter protest in summer 2020, Black people's mistrust of vaccination was legitimated in the public sphere. Suddenly, and you've all noticed this, I know, there's a discourse about Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks, and J. Marion Sims that explains and it historically situates Black communities' longstanding suspicion of medicine. The news reporting on vaccine hesitancy did a 180, shifting from a pretty steady diet of misinformed parents, internet charlatans, and irrational celebrities to a serious, if limited, consideration of how mistrust of medicine in communities of color is based in a history of discrimination and exploitation, that is, medical racism. This emerging recognition of historical and contemporary mistrust contributed to an official public health shift from misinformation to confidence as frames for understanding vaccine hesitancy. So these are my questions. Why are white women so easily represented as overprivileged and socially blind, easily duped and dangerous to their children and the whole society? Why has there been no history offered for white women's vaccine concerns, even though there is a long history of vaccination resistance in Western societies, dating back to compulsory laws about smallpox vaccination in the 19th century? And will the shift toward understanding mistrust of vaccines and away from misinformation change attitudes toward vaccine dissenting white mothers? So the representation of duped and dangerous white mothers is not actually all that different from how Black women are represented, except with respect to other issues, drugs, poverty, single motherhood. Thus, women in general are seen to be dangerous to their children. This perception justifies regulating women and managing them to be proper mothers. White middle-class women become dangerous because they know too much for their own good and use their privilege selfishly, endangering others' children. Black women, whose historical concerns about vaccines are legitimated, are nevertheless seen to be incorrect and in need of persuasion. And that in that quotation I showed from Fauci, he basically sort of says, well, these concerns exist, but really they're no longer pertinent. Or Black women are in need of protection by sanctimonious white mothers. Will the newfound understanding that Black mistrust of medicine is grounded in historical exploitation and discrimination change the calculus that sees white middle-class women's distrust of vaccination as illegitimate? Will it change even our notion of who it is who distrusts vaccination regimes? If we were to do a similar historical analysis for white women, what would we find? What is startling to me is a feminist blindness to the sexism in much of the analysis of vaccination consent, a blaming of women within feminist analysis, putatively through calling attention to poor and non-white children, but not registering why their mothers' concerns have not been subject to scrutiny and analysis. So we basically ignore the actual concerns of poor and non-white women in the way that we address a vaccine dissent. The Fauci-Lemon conversation suggests the toxicity of aligning Black people's concerns about vaccination with the existing perception of anti-vaxxers. Black people, Lemon is at pains to make clear, have legitimate reasons to be wary of vaccination. Fauci backs him up, even though he also suggests there is absolutely no reason to continue this mistrust of medicine and vaccines now. Because in other words, no racism is going on currently in medical research or drug manufacture. What is revealed is a general belief that while white middle-class women have no legitimate reason to resist vaccination, that Black mistrust is its own separate and legitimate thing, and that everyone's actual concerns about vaccines can be explained away because medicine just doesn't work that way anymore and should be trusted to do the right thing. And I'll stop here and I'll stop the share. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Really looking forward to getting into the discussion. Our next speaker is Dr. Elena Konis. Dr. Konis is a historian of medicine and public health and a member of the faculty of the School of Journalism, Program in Media Studies, and Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society at Berkeley. And she's the author of Vaccine Nation, published by the University of Chicago in 2015. She has a new edited volume coming out this spring, Pink and Blue, Gender, Culture, and the Health of Children with Rutgers University Press, and 2 more forthcoming books, one on the pesticide DDT and one on the history of measles. And if that is not enough, she is also currently conducting research on the history of belief exemptions to mandatory vaccination. Welcome, Dr. Konis.
Thank you so much, Farron. Thank you for bringing us all here today for what is going to be, I'm sure, a really exciting conversation. I regret going so early in the lineup because I'm really excited to hear the comments of the other panelists who still haven't had a chance to speak yet. So I've decided to use my time, my 10 minutes here, to provide us just with a sort of historical background and context for what I'm hoping and actually believe will be a really stimulating and productive and important conversation. As Bernice mentioned a couple of moments ago, there's a long history of anti-vaccination. Anti-vaccination, when I use the term, means something very, very specific. It means opposition to all vaccines or vaccination in general as a matter of principle. And in its 19th century origins, it referred specifically to opposition to smallpox vaccination and more specifically compulsory smallpox vaccination. But the larger point that I want to make about anti-vaccination, which is often used incorrectly and interchangeably with vaccine hesitancy, is that anti-vaccination has been with us as long as vaccination has been with us. And I'm sure that this is something that Travis, you might be likely to mention in a few moments. Ever since we began vaccinating against smallpox and using the force of law or the incentives of rule and regulation to encourage or promote widespread vaccination, we have seen popular resistance or full-on opposition to vaccination. And if we look at this long history and kind of pull back and take sort of a 200-year bird's eye view, what we see is these kind of arguments against vaccination taking 3 familiar forms: arguments about the risks associated with vaccination, arguments about the rights infringed upon by compulsory or mandatory vaccination, and arguments that vaccination in its compulsory or voluntary form is in some way in conflict with religious beliefs, which in the 20th century gets expanded to include spiritual and secular beliefs. I think of these as, again, as the 3 R's: religion, rights, and risks. Those articulations of the problems of vaccination have been with us again for more than 200 years now. When I first started studying the history of vaccination about 12 or almost 13 years ago now, however, I was studying it just as we were seeing our national debate over vaccination kind of reach a sort of fever pitch, a level of engagement and visibility that it hadn't had in a very long time, actually about 100 years. At that time, it was the early 21st century. And as a historian, I had to look back essentially to the early 20th century to see vaccination opposition getting as much public attention and engagement. What I noticed in that moment was that looking at the historical literature, there was a lot of understanding of historical actors with vaccination criticisms or vaccine criticisms. They were understood as part of social movements, for instance. They were understood as articulating oppositions that stemmed from their involvement in movements to protect children, to abolish slavery, to further the care and protection of animals, and to further the protection of individual rights. But even as we had articulated this for historical actors, what I noticed in contemporary media and public discourse in the early 21st century was that, as Bernice has so nicely already illustrated for us, the person opposed to vaccination was typically represented as usually female, often but not always white, and uniformly irrational and anti-scientific. This was, of course, a much less nuanced representation than the historical representations we have of vaccination opposition. So I was curious where this came from. Again, zooming out to take sort of a bird's eye view, I decided to try to look at the contours and the ebb and flow of anti-vaccination, and I'm using this term more loosely now, over the 20th century. What I noticed in this work was that anti-vaccination, after experiencing a heyday in the progressive era, quieted down and reemerged really in the early 70s, on the tail of and influenced by the emergence of a host of social movements. It wasn't, however, simply the emergence of these social movements that led to this upswelling of what I'm now going to call vaccine critical discourse. It was an expansion of federal involvement, an expansion of state power to promote vaccination, not on a voluntary basis, but on a compulsory basis, which again, at that point in time, the 1960s and early 70s, we hadn't really relied on since the turn of the 20th century. So this was, again, in the late 60s and early 70s, a new moment of compulsory vaccination taking place in the context of a wide range of social movements: the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the women's health movement, disability rights movement, gay rights movement, environmental movement, and so on. And as I looked at the vaccine critical discourse of this time, what I noticed was there was a lot of overlap between the rhetoric and ideas of some of these movements and the types of arguments that members of the public were articulating against vaccination. And I'm going to, because this is a panel on feminist lessons for vaccine hesitancy, focus for the next couple of minutes just on what women's movement participants, and in particular members of the women's health movement, were saying that then got adopted by some women, not self-proclaimed anti-vaxxers, not even self-proclaimed vaccine hesitant individual, but just women generally getting their children vaccinated, what these women adopted from these movements. So the women's health movement, there's of course much we can say about it, but in 2 minutes, I want to pull out a couple of different moments from this movement. One was a focus on the birth control pill and hazards and risks associated with that pill that had not been disclosed to women who were prescribed or given the pill. It was a journalist, Barbara Seaman, who brought these to light, and then women's health activists who advocated for a safer pill and successfully got one. And in the course of advocating for that pill and securing that safer pill, also had a key role to play in the provision of drug safety information to patients more generally. So we have women's health movement participants articulating an idea that members of the public need to take an active role in ensuring the safety of pharmaceuticals that are given to them. Another moment in this movement includes women saying that they want to have more of a role in what childbirth looks like, that they don't simply want to go into twilight sleep and let their male doctors control the process, but rather want to be an active participant of it. And a last moment in this movement is, again, women saying that medicine as an institution has been characterized by patriarchal exercise of power and paternalistic attitudes towards women. So coming out of the women's health movement, we have a handful of ideas that I just want to highlight again. A question about the safety of pharmaceuticals, a question, and I didn't quite get to this, but a related question about the necessity of pharmaceuticals, a question about whether women should be participants in their own medical care, and a question about how much information they should have access to in order to make their own informed decisions about that care. Well, I wish I had a scenario slide like Bernice showed us, because when I landed on this one source from the early 70s, it was this aha moment where I saw one of the founders of Mothering Magazine writing about giving birth and raising her young children and asking a question about vaccines and saying, well, now I've been kind of educated to ask all of these questions about my own healthcare. Now I'm being told to simply vaccinate my child. I'm going to ask the same questions about that. What are these vaccines for? Are they safe? Are they necessary? And can I have all of the information about the risks associated with them? And what we saw over the course of the 70s was more and more women asking for this information, getting, in some cases, that information, looking at it and realizing that actually vaccines do carry risks. We simply wish we had been told and wish that we had been given a chance to be informed participants in a decision-making process about whether and when to give these vaccines to our children. To kind of wrap this up very briefly, I want to acknowledge that there was a flip side to this discourse. In the 60s and 70s, as these vaccines for children were being mandated through state laws that required them for school enrollment, what we see at the same time that feminist rhetoric is giving the public new tools and vocabulary for questioning vaccines, we see policymakers saying, these new vaccines that we have against diseases such as measles and mumps, they're for admittedly milder diseases than smallpox, polio, and diphtheria. However, we are in a new moment in which so many families have 2 working parents. And we're in a moment in which it costs a lot for people to take time off from work. So it makes sense in this, again, new moment. It's not explicit, but it's implicit that this is a moment in which women are returning to workplaces and are not at home taking full-time care of children. In this moment, policymakers articulated that it makes sense now to make vaccination compulsory. These forces are something that we can trace through the 80s and 90s, right into the early 2000s, when we then see, and I hesitate to bring Jenny McCarthy into this, but we then see Jenny McCarthy featured in many media appearances saying many of the things that health feminists of 30 and 40 years earlier had said. We want more information about vaccine risks, and we want to be granted the information to make individual decisions, and lastly, treated as experts in our own children's healthcare. There's much more to say. I'm going to leave it at that because I'm very excited to hear my fellow panelists. So thank you all.
Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Yolanda Wilson. Dr. Wilson is an associate professor in the Albert Nagy Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University, with affiliations in the departments of philosophy and African American studies. She earned her PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she was inducted into the Academy of Distinguished Teaching Scholars. Dr. Wilson's work centers on race and gender justice, particularly as it relates to healthcare. a 2019-2020 National Humanities Center Fellow, and a 2019-2020 Encore Public Voices Fellow. She is currently working on a monograph entitled Black Death, Racial Justice, Priority Setting, and Care at the End of Life, in which she uses end-of-life care to argue that given historic and continuing racial injustice leading to African Americans being unfairly burdened with ill health, African Americans have a special justice claim on healthcare. More broadly, her areas of interest include bioethics, social and political philosophy, race theory, and feminist theory, subjects that she has written on widely in her award-winning public scholarship, which has appeared in the Hastings Center's Bioethics Forum and The Conversation, which has been republished in outlets including the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, Salon.com, and the Philly Voice. And so we're very thrilled to invite Dr. Wilson back, if virtually, to the Triangle.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm just so happy to be here and just excited to hear from my colleagues. Let me start my timer so that I don't ramble. Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you all for gathering this afternoon. So in thinking about this morning's conversation, it occurred to me that it would be important to tease out what might be distinctly feminist about some expressions of vaccine hesitancy in this current moment. So, my two previous co-panelists have done an amazing job at kind of laying out the problem. So some of this ground may seem a little familiar, but popular media has not done a great job considering the nuances of why some populations may express concerns about either the vaccine itself or how it is being marketed and distributed, or what communities might be adversely affected with the adoption of various distribution schema, instead preferring to lump anti-vaxxers, those concerned with the medical establishment's history of abuse, and those who worry about the justness of certain distribution schema in the same category. While popular media isn't known for nuance, it doesn't do any good, and in fact, it may actually do harm to fail to recognize that questions about this vaccine arise from different experiences, different senses of history, different cultural memories, and different on-the-ground realities of day-to-day living. So I'll focus on two aspects of a distinctly feminist bioethical orientation that can provide context to specifically feminist rationales for vaccine hesitancy. Indeed, as a bioethicist, I've been called fairly frequently in recent months to offer expertise about a variety of ethical issues that have arisen relating to the pandemic. And as a Black woman bioethicist, I'm often called to make sense of phenomena that have recently been discovered to affect the lives of actual people, like the inherent vulnerability of essential work. So of course, by discovered, I mean white people have figured out that they can't ignore this any longer. And we can talk about that during Q&A. Yet the single most infuriating email I received was from a journalist who wanted me to explain to him, quote, why Black people don't trust science. So I responded with a sternly worded email that Black people didn't have any special distrust of science, but that I said a few choice things. I hope I was still professional and reasonably polite, but I wanted to be very clear that given a long history and continuing practice of medical and scientific racism, scientists might be another matter. And so this is where I want to begin my remarks. So I won't detail a litany of examples, or as Thomas Jefferson would say, a long chain of abuses, of all the ways in which the medical establishment has engaged in racist, sexist, ableist behavior. And many of us gathered here can likely name a few without any prompting from me. However, what is only recently being fully appreciated, and I'm probably overly optimistic about this, is the damages that these practices have done to communities. So I have another piece that that's actually in progress, where I'm actually questioning the value of trust, because that seems to be being legitimized now, this notion of distrust. And there are ways of talking about it that I think are a little lazy. We can talk about that in Q&A. I won't go into great detail about that, but I think that right, it's a double-edged sword, right? In one sense, I'm glad that there's at least an acknowledgement of kind of historic and continuing and contemporary reasons for distrust. And at the other On the other side of that, I think that this kind of over-reliance on narratives of distrust doesn't quite capture all of the ways of injustice that need to be rectified. So I'll put a pin in that for now. But in addition to the direct harms that those who've experienced forced sterilizations, denials of treatment, and secret medical experiments is the grief and devastation of all the members of those communities who've witnessed those harms and were left to pick up the pieces. The loss of loved ones, the loss of limbs, the loss of fertility have all left their marks on communities who have experienced them at the hands of institutions and often with the, if only tacit, approval of government. What conditions does this create going forward? And when those harms aren't repaired, the harms not only linger, but they become part of the cultural memory generation after generation. So to show up on the doorsteps of these same communities and say, trust us, is a tall ask. It's an unfair ask. And yet to paint these same communities as irrational or stupid for being skeptical is an insult on top of the injury. Moreover, the failure to understand, the lack of empathy, the lack of even an attempt to learn the history and hear the stories of those who have been negatively impacted by medical practice further harms any well-intentioned efforts to ensure access to medical interventions. So a feminist bioethic, I would say, begins with community. So whereas in other conceptions of bioethics in the West, the fundamental unit of concern is a hypothetical, rational, autonomous, generally male being, the idea that we are all interdependent on one another undergirds the feminist bioethic. So how does that matter? Well, the starting point has to be that the harm done to some subset of the community harms the community. And the onus is not on those who've been harmed to get over it. Rather, the onus is on the entire community to not harm in the first place. At this point, one may object that ethical violations like the Tuskegee experiment or the Mississippi appendectomy, which is the practice of sterilizing Black women without their knowledge or consent, are clear ethical breaches, and that one does not have to hold any particularly feminist conception of bioethics to see this. And I would reply that to the extent that these kinds of ethical breaches continue to happen, albeit in various forms, that a feminist bioethic may be precisely the foundational bioethical approach that is needed. So here's the plain truth. One cannot continue to breach trust and then get upset when people don't trust you. To begin one's medical scientific endeavors from a place of being responsible to the communities in which one operates and the communities that will be affected by scientific medical discovery sets up an entirely different kind of framework that is, for me at least, the heart of a feminist vaccine hesitancy. The place of community in the development and distribution of vaccines and the trust that is or is not fostered as a result of accounting for the community in which one operates can explain some of the worries that we see articulated today. But connected to worries about community and trust is the place of care and caregiving in feminist bioethics. It is often the women in communities who are primarily tasked with care work. One cannot divorce questions about vaccine efficacy, safety, and distribution from this reality. And when one considers discussions about vulnerability, for example, a significant bioethical principle is that we will all, a significant feminist bioethical principle is that we will all experience moments and degrees of vulnerability at varying points in our lives. But to make the point even finer, an explicitly Black feminist bioethic acknowledges this and also the reality that due to structural, racial, gendered injustice, those who are more likely to be both vulnerable and also left with the responsibility of caring for those who experience vulnerability are Black women and other women of color, often for low wages and very little protection. In other words, women of color are more likely to be vulnerable, placing us in need of care, while simultaneously tasked with caring for others. In this context, asking questions about vaccine safety, efficacy, and the rationale of various vaccine distribution schema isn't irrational or silly, it's prudent. So one point of clarification, the mere fact of asking questions, asking for evidence, asking for confirmation, isn't hesitancy in the sense that the term is often used. So I'm a philosopher and I'm really into kind of concepts and terms and clarity. And I would like, at least in the Q&A, for us to even think about what vaccine hesitancy means. I mean, I've kind of taken it for granted through some of my remarks. But in most other contexts, doing one's homework, so to speak, is a matter of due diligence. And it's not only encouraged, but it's expected from reasonable adults. that these same behaviors are framed, in some populations at least, as irrational, or at least as a problem to be addressed, or even as a problem to be ignored for their own good, right, for these paternalistic reasons, is itself a problem that reflects whose concerns are taken seriously and by whom. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So our next speaker is Dr. Travis Chiwinglao. Dr. Lau completed his PhD in English at the University of Pennsylvania and is currently assistant professor of English at Kenyon College. His research and teaching focus on 18th and 19th century British literature and culture, health humanities, and disability studies. Dr. Lau is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Insecure Immunity, Inoculation and Anti-Vaccination, 1720 to 1898, which explores the British cultural history of immunity and vaccination and the rise of the security state in the 18th and 19th centuries. Alongside his scholarship, Dr. Lau frequently writes for venues of public scholarship, such as Synapsis, a journal of health humanities, Public Books, Lapham's Quarterly, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And his poetry has appeared in Barron Magazine, Word Gathering, Glass, South Carolina Review, Fog Lifter, and The New Engagement, as well as in two chapbooks, The Bone Setter by Damaged Goods Press in 2019, and Pairing, published by Finishing Line Press, which just came out in 2020. So thanks so much, Dr. Lau, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. First, allow me to express my deepest thanks to Farron for bringing us together in dialogue. This event is such a joy to be part of, precisely because I've learned so much from my co-panelists. So many of you I've read and have now a chance to meet. Before I begin, I'd like to offer what my disability colleagues have called access notes, or an access check-in. While this presentation is being given remotely, I encourage you to inhabit the space you're in, stand, lay down, spread out, and stim, and inhabit your body minds as fully as you need to during the course of this conversation. Zoom has since instituted live talk-to-text captioning, but should this not work, I often tell my students to use webcaptioner.com, which is a free live captioning service. And the link I've just put into the chat is a full script of this talk if you'd like to follow along with an access copy. If there are other ways I can make this talk accessible to you, please do not hesitate to let me know. I think a lot about disability scholar Tanya Tichkowski's definition of access, which she has described as the interpretive relationship between bodies. And my goal in my classroom, in my scholarship, and even in these brief remarks is to enable as many body minds to engage in that interpretive relationship and collective knowledge making as possible. Access, as we should all know, is not a rote set of boxes we check off, nor a set of compliances that allow us to claim diversity in some way, but is a moving target that we adapt toward the needs of specific body minds that share a room, this room, right? This matters whether we are in a Zoom call or together in a classroom or in a lecture hall. And I think the pandemic has only made clearer how important access is to the future of the collective work we do in the Academy. So in what little time I have, I wanted to share an overview of my current book project on the literary and cultural history of vaccination and immunity in the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain. And I take very seriously Farron's invitation for us to think about how our work might make feminist interventions. So I thought I'd begin with one of my project's origin stories that I hope will make clear what the feminist stakes might be of this book. So during my last year, undergraduate year at UCLA, I happened to be at a cafe reading Seth Mnookin's 2011 The Panic Virus. It was a pop science book that attempted to make sense of what underpinned growing movements in favor of anti-vaccination. Another patron came up to me asking about the book and began to talk about their responsibility as neighborhood point person for organizing what are called chickenpox parties. Infected kids would be invited to play with healthy kids so that they would contract chickenpox naturally. Rather than using vaccines to generate an artificial immunity, they insisted this method gave their child natural immunity instead. Quote, "I'm not anti-vaccination, I'm just pro-disease. Chickenpox you can get over, but autism is a life sentence." Where did this ideological position come from and to what ends? For me, tracing the historical formation of this rhetoric is crucial for understanding the interconnection between culture and health. The vulnerability of children has long been central to the anti-vaccination movement's provocative counter-narratives against Western medicine's trust in vaccines as the key to eradicating and preventing epidemic disease. Yet, the figure of the child at risk would also be a cornerstone of pro-vaccination arguments aiming to protect the most vulnerable members of the population. The child's symbolic power as a representation of national futurity continues to animate anti-vaccination discourse, particularly after Andrew Wakefield's infamous 1998 paper, which made a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. After quite literally going viral, Wakefield's research was later exposed as unethical and fraudulent, leading to the revoking of his medical license and the Lancet's recanting of that paper. This anti-autism dimension is but another mutation of anti-vaccination rhetoric and imagery dating back to the late 18th century that sensationalized cultural anxieties about disability, particularly cognitive disability, as with fears of cow mania or the fear of the vaccinated degenerating into a bovine state as a side effect of vaccination substitution of cowpox for smallpox. Unsurprisingly, discussions of the anti-vax movement have tended to focus on 20th and 21st centuries when vaccination technologies rapidly developed in relation to wartime medicine. I'm thinking of pertussis, polio, HPV, and diphtheria vaccines that provoked dramatic public outrage that led to the formation of extremely organized anti-vaccination activist groups. Even though many people tend to think of anti-vaccination as a recent cultural development, the politicizing of inoculation began 2 centuries before. And this is where I really appreciated both Bernice and Elena's nod to this earlier history and something that I'm very committed to in this conversation. In conceiving of my project, I wanted to revise what felt like a persistent narrative of novelty that kept circulating in popular media and even among fellow academics, that anti-vaccination was somehow new or reducible to new forms of pseudoscience, anti-science, religious fundamentalism, or neoliberalism. Such a reductive approach to this issue is ahistorical in its erasure of a much longer political and cultural history of immunity that underpins these debates about national health. To that end, my approach is to refuse the binary model of pro and anti-vax, to consider the ways in which health and security as a biological, ideological, and narrative concept is shared and mobilized by these seemingly separate positions towards speculative visions of, in this case, Britain's future as a national body. One of my project's primary interventions is to recover this often forgotten prehistory, one that happens to be literary. So speaking of the literary, my project attends to unexpected sources like propaganda poems, pamphlets, plays, essays that actively shape the vaccine debates since Edward Jenner's popularization of vaccination in the late 1790s and later grounded the anti-vaccination organizing of the mid to late 19th centuries. I have recently been working on a chapter about sentimental childhood in the Victorian vaccination debates in the wake of compulsory vaccination legislation in the middle of the century. Lydia Murdoch has traced how smallpox treatises in the 18th and 19th centuries contributed to an ongoing cultural debate about the status of children. Murdoch emphasizes that Western medicine long depended on colonial or working class bodies for experimentation without affording them the benefits of treatments and prophylactics that were assumed to be the intrinsic right of the upper echelons of English society. Who was deemed most worthy of protection was intimately connected with representations of children's physical responses to disease, with emotional meanings highlighting the children's affective ties to their parents, thereby creating emotional and legal protections regarding the rights of these children. Good parenting in these representations meant an unquestioning commitment to the state's regime of early childhood vaccination and a submission to the documentary surveillance of vaccine censuses. While pro-vaccinators focus their attention on children as evidence for the state's concern for the most vulnerable members of English society, anti-vaccinators countered with their own version of sentimental childhood that exposed what they argued was state-supported violence performed upon innocent children in the name of public health. A binary understanding of these debates that reduce and confine these issues to pro versus anti-vax drastically oversimplify the shared rhetorical strategies between these two positions that both depended on highly symbolic figures like the innocent child who embodied the white, able-bodied, heteronormative future of the British nation. John Gibbs's inflammatory rights-based polemics like Our Medical Liberties or The Personal Rights of the Subject in 1854 exemplified a sort of staple strategy of anti-vaccination activism through the distribution of handbills and pamphlets detailing sensationalist accounts of vaccine injury and the indignity of forced vaccinations by law. Three major anti-vaccination periodicals arose in the 1860s and the 1870s: the Anti-Vaccinator, the Anti-Compulsory Vaccination Reporter, and the Vaccination Inquirer. All of these publications repeatedly relied upon the figure of the innocent child as a tragic victim of medical malpractice or the vulnerable target of predatory quackery. Anti-vaccinators carefully collected and documented vaccination disasters and vaccine injuries, as evidenced by the work of W.J. Furnival, a Staffordshire anti-vaccinator who published alongside his condemnation of vaccination numerous photographs of who he claimed to be deformed and dead children marred by vaccine injury. Anti-vaccinators like Furnival took advantage of the developing documentary technology of the photograph and the visceral immediacy of these graphic images to develop a visual vocabulary of sentimentalism that effectively galvanized parents into anti-vaccination movements, while also memorializing vaccine-injured children as heroic martyrs for the cause. Such emotional appeals to parents or potential parents were predictably gendered. The anti-vax movement identified different, if complementary, roles for male and female agitators and relied on explicitly gendered rhetoric that appealed to Victorian ideals of masculinity and femininity. Men were often called upon to be independent agents of resistance who intervened in the politics that sought to deprive them of their authority as sovereigns and providers of the household, while women were asked to contribute to the movement by serving as domestic defenders of their children's well-being and as symbols of suffering motherhood. While anti-vaccinators were almost always presumed to be men, anti-vaccination was always also a question of mothers' natural rights to choose how best to care for her children. This should sound a lot like the mommy warriors of many contemporary anti-vaccination campaigns. Take, for instance, and I also am loath to bring up Jenny McCarthy, but her infamous Oprah interview, where she described to a room full of mothers the soul leaving her son's eyes after a routine vaccination. Such highly public forms of parental performance echo the spectacular, sentimentalized biopolitics of children's health that became central to the Victorian debates over compulsory vaccination, culminating in mass protests like the one in Leicester, where children marchers composed of supposed victims of vaccine injury and their able-bodied siblings and friends, potentially marred by vaccination, paraded through the streets while a figure of Edward Jenner burned in effigy. While I think historians of vaccination have rightly attended to the gender dynamics in these movements, I've been thinking a lot about the readings of Sentimental Childhood that have yet to fully engage with more recent queer and crip theoretical interventions into childhood studies more broadly. Queer scholars, including Jack Halberstam, Lee Edelman, and Jose Esteban Munoz, have challenged normativizing models of temporality that idealize notions of progress and perfectibility, and which displace non-heterosexual, non-procreative relations as backward, deviant, literally veering away from a straight path, and pathological. Feminist disability scholars like Alison Kafer, Margaret Price, and Ellen Samuels have built upon these theories of queer temporality to argue for crip time that attend to the ways disabled lives similarly deviate from normative life trajectories defined by health and productivity that casts disabled people as out of time or as obstacles to the arc of progress. Anti-vaccinators capitalized on disability's undesirability by stressing how compulsory vaccination effectively disabled children by casting them out of their developmental trajectories and doing nothing to rehabilitate them. Pro-vaccinators similarly framed vaccine refusal as a cruel exposure of children to health risk that could disable them for life or even kill them. To refuse compulsory vaccination was to refuse the benevolence of the state that imagined better futures for British children and their development into productive British citizens. I want to stress here the dependency on the sentimental capital of the afflicted child, which underpinned and continues to underpin the affective politics of Western vaccination debates. And I'm so interested in hearing my colleagues talk about their relationship to this figure of the child in relation to our ongoing conversations about motherhood. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for that. So our final speaker is Dr. Nicole Charles. Dr. Charles is an assistant professor of women and gender studies and feminist studies in culture and media in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Inside and outside of academia, Dr. Charles thinks about questions and cultures of care, healing, affects, technoscience, anti-racism, and colonialism in the Black diaspora. Her forthcoming book, Suspicion, with Duke University Press, examines the post-colonial, transnational, and effective stakes behind the promotion and refusal of the human papillomavirus, or the HPV vaccine, in Barbados. So I'm so thrilled to welcome Dr. Charles to Duke.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Farron. Thank you all for your offerings. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you all. And thank you to Duke for organizing and hosting. So I'm zooming in today from Toronto, Canada, where I'm working from home on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And just in taking a moment to reflect on the continual occupation of these lands, I am mindful of how we might be in good relation and care with each other in this space as we activate feminist work and thought. And so in thinking of what I wanted to share today, I was struck by Farron's proposition, which Jocelyn reiterated in her introduction, that a feminist approach to vaccine hesitancy can help us envision a more enduring solution to this crisis of care. Thoughts of care and carelessness have been permeating our consciousness for some time, and it strikes me that in this moment, COVID-19 vaccines are being positioned as or understood to perform care work, or at the very least, facilitate medical professionals' care. They're seen as technologies that extend what many perceive to be an always already benevolent field of biomedicine and science. Positioning COVID-19 and other vaccines as performers of care in this way overlooks the fundamental ambivalence of such technologies, which are, of course, fundamentally and irreducibly ambivalent. Likewise, the word care exhibits antithetical meanings of suffering, sorrow, grief, and also efforts to protect from or assuage these troubles. Insofar as public health discourses surrounding vaccination are often oriented toward a scientific logic of risk reduction as the basis for care and medical intervention, they effectively obscure these tensions that exist between risk and care. Tensions that are amplified within contemporary biopolitical public health campaigns, such as those around COVID-19 and the vaccine, that further articulate the population risk logic of vaccination with that of morality and rationality. And as you know, Yolanda, these conversations and associations often overlook the care work that racialized women are engaged with and subsequently in need of, in part due to this work. Very often, vaccine hesitancy among racialized communities, and in my work specifically among Black Barbadians, holds a mirror to the violence that is often implicit in our caring and naming of care practices. It unveils the injurious histories that have existed alongside healthcare and to the lingering power of historical narratives of ignorance that surface within discourses of vaccine hesitancy and refusal. And they necessitate, yet again, more pause, more hesitancy to ethically revisit this question of care, one that hopefully departs from an intensified neoliberal authoritarianism. So some of the questions that resonate for me and that I've been thinking about for the better part of a decade and that are so exciting to talk about now when people want to talk about them are, how might the rationale or perceived rationale behind care affect the ways that care is both offered and received? What can hesitancy toward biomedical and technological forms of care teach us about histories of risk, biotechnologies, and the imperative to care? What might it mean to embody protection by means of hesitancy toward these very medico-technological deployments of care? And what are the stakes of affective attachments that refuse this care in favor of a radical care as a guiding force and principle in our societies? Novelist Arundhati Roy reminds us that this pandemic we're in is, quote, a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. One where we can trudge through or, quote, walk through lightly, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. how can or how does vaccine hesitancy help in our imagining of another world, a different kind of care? And I'm thinking here that this need not conflict with public health efforts to improve vaccine compliance to prevent death from COVID-19, but in fact urgently inform and enrich these energies and support the holistic health of our populations with an ethics of care that is capacious and that's about presence. In my forthcoming book, Suspicion, I am offering a transnational Black feminist analysis of Black Barbadians' suspicion toward the human papillomavirus vaccine, in conversation with a body of transnational feminist scholarship that is really interested in teasing out the afterlives of slavery, the movement and mobilization of power, relationality and affect across space and time, and the exacerbated inequalities produced by neoliberalism in the Anglophone Caribbean. I consider what it means to understand suspicion toward this vaccine as theory and praxis both, as generative and fraught, sticky and contagious, because it is palimpsestic, living and lasting in the body, in embodied memories and histories of Afro-Barbadians in ways that are difficult, if not impossible, to let go of. There's been a growing interest across the social sciences in theorizing this concept of refusal as a subject that has productive social and political openings. And scholars have taken up this term to think about refusal as a method evident within and response to politics and political action, and also as a response to scientific advancements from stem cell transplants to vaccines. Tina Camp defines refusal as, quote, the urgency of rethinking the time, space, and fundamental vocabulary of what constitutes politics, activism, and theory, as well as what it means to refuse the terms given to us to name these struggles, end quote. As a Black feminist practice and commitment to reject the status quo that renders Blackness illegible, refusal simultaneously creates and names possibilities for recognition in the face of state-driven neglect and negation. Indigenous feminists like Audra Simpson, Kim Tolbe, Eve Tuck, and others similarly invite us to consider the generativity of refusal as both everyday forms of interruption and disengagement that Indigenous peoples employ, and the precipice of change from which new forms of techno-scientific developments and cultural sovereignty can emerge for Indigenous peoples. And I'm recapping some of this because I think there's so much to be gained in our analysis of vaccine hesitancy by being in conversation with this dynamic body of Black and Indigenous feminist scholarship around refusal and its gesture toward generativity. And while I'm theorizing vaccine hesitancy in my book, Suspicion, as distinct from refusal, it interrogates the biomedical offerings of care that are being presented by vaccines. And rather than seeing suspicion as a practice or a tactic or a form of refusal, I'm offering suspicion as an affective relation that circulates within the various socioeconomic, political, and historical formations that contextualize this vaccine. And I think much can be said about the introduction of the COVID-19 vaccines today. When we understand suspicion as affective, it necessarily complicates biomedical narratives around suspicion and hesitancy as mere fraught and irrational refusals of biomedical care or protection, or refusals based in public misunderstandings of science. And if we choose to learn from this affective pedagogy, suspicion promises capacious insights for public health and medical practitioners, as well as for feminists, technoscience, and humanities scholars who, like myself, might be hesitant to produce really neat endpoints to what are inescapably entangled biopolitics of past and present. Even as many of us here in this panel and others who are engaged with this work have to some degree steered or begun to steer the conversation on vaccine hesitancy, at least in the media, away from ignorance and misunderstandings of science towards such discussions of an erosion of trust towards scientific practice and experiments and associated pharmaceutical technologies. Medicine and technoscience continue to engage in what Ruha Benjamin terms analytic somersaults in order to frame contemporary hesitancy and medical distrust both as inexplicable, because Bernice, as you said, that was in the past. Saidiya Hartman says Black people's lives remain devalued and imperiled socially and politically, such that this devaluation is entrenched into the now. And there's no benefit in believing that Black folks are merely obsessed with or burdened by the past. What's missing is a reckoning with this history, which inheres in the present by public health professionals in an effort to engage communities' concerns with accountability and transparency. So, and this is the end, fraught as it is, vaccine hesitancy and suspicion ought not solely be viewed as curiosities and impediments to overcome, but instead understood and engaged with for their gestures towards less injurious, more transparent forms of healthcare promotion that are accountable to our diverse communities, long-standing histories of medical racism and experimentation on people of color, and that recognize the deep and warranted discomfort as well as injustice that is embedded in industry-funded healthcare education, biotechnologies, and research. Vaccine hesitancy reveals care's inequalities and political stakes by mapping how healthcare work, biomedical authority, state priorities, assemblages, and non-innocent histories of colonial medical injustice intertwine. Failing to attend to these considerations ultimately diminishes the efficacy of public health efforts and continues to erode the public's trust in its governments and medical institutions.